Our first question comes from Scott out of Beaufort, South Carolina. He writes, Pastor, are you aware of the Jewish belief that creation would go on for 7,000 years from the date of creation, and that the last 1,000 years of that would be the millennial reign of Christ? Is there anything that supports that biblically? And if so, where do we fall in that timeline?
No, it's a good question, and it's not precisely what's taught. They say in the Talmud, so maybe I need to define some terms here. The word Talmud is a Hebrew word that means learning or instruction. And the Talmud is made up of two parts. It's made up of the Mishnah and the Gemara. So in Jewish belief, and rightly so, the first 5 books God gave Moses directly, and he wrote them down by inspiration of the Spirit. Every single word there in the Torah, the Pentateuch for 5, Pentateuchos, the 5 books of the law, Tukos. And so that's the Greek title. And so interestingly, in our Bible, our English Bibles, the first 5 books are from the Septuagint titles. In either case, he wrote that down. That's the Torah. They also say that God explained to Moses the meaning of certain laws that he recorded, and he in turn explained them to the people. And I have no doubt that he expounded the meaning of passages, but they argue that the oral law, what was passed down from Moses to Joshua all the way to rabbis throughout the centuries, that's equally inspired by God. Well, after the Jews were dispersed in 70 AD, there was some concern, hey, we're spread out everywhere. We need to protect the oral law, and so they wrote it down. That became the Talmud. Now, to make it more complicated, there's actually 2 Talmuds. There's what we call the Babylonian Talmud, and there's the Jerusalem Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud predates the Jerusalem Talmud, but they're written around 200. And some would have problems with the name Jerusalem Talmud, and I suppose rightly so, in that they would call it the Land of Israel Talmud or the Palestinian Talmud, because by this time, of course, Rome had renamed Israel into Palestine, and so it's called that. And no Jews were living in Jerusalem when the Talmud was written. Now, when you think about the Talmud, the Mishnah, the oral law, it's made up of 2 parts. As I said, the Mishnah is identical in both Talmuds. The Gemara, which is basically a commentary on the oral law, is different in 2 books. But they both affirm in this case that up until 6,000 years, the Messiah could come back. So they don't say it has to be 6,000 years. But until 6,000 years, and the analogy that they use is that of the Sabbath. They would say, well, the Sabbath starts at sundown. However, if a person wants to start his Sabbath early, he's free to do that. And by analogy, they would argue that if Messiah wants to return before the 6,000 years, then indeed he could do that. Now, let me just say, the Talmud is no more inspired than the Quran or the Book of Mormon or any other book. In fact, there are things that are written in the Talmud that are in direct contradiction to Scripture. For instance, if you speak today to a modern Orthodox Jew and they are giving you a reason for what makes a person Jewish ethnically, they say it's passed down through the woman. Well, the Bible teaches it's not passed down through the woman. Where do they get that? They get that from the oral law. The Bible is clear by example that Jewishness is passed down not by the mother, but by the father. And so Joseph could marry a believing Egyptian and have Jewish children. Moses could marry a non-Jewish descendant of Abraham and have Jewish children. Why? Because Jewishness is not determined by the mother, but by the father. And so with that said, the Talmud, and I could give dozens of examples, are in many places in direct contradiction not only to the Old Testament, but also to the New Testament as well. Now, according to tradition, Jewish tradition, they say that the world was created 3761. They would say BCE, before the Common Era. They divide the calendar, of course, before the Common Era and after the Common Era. And of course, that's not a problem for me. I use before Christ, Anno Domini, in the year of the Lord AD 2023. In either case, it was the resurrection of Christ and his presence on the earth that ultimately split time down in half. And so based on the Jewish calendar, the 6,000th year is about 18 or 17 years away. And so, but again, they would say that that Messiah could come. But again, they're making a parallel here, and it's interesting in some respects because the millennial reign of Christ is 1,000 years, mille, from the Latin thousand, annum year, so 1,000 years. So we speak of the millennium from a Latin word, and we use it in our English Bibles, and rightly so, to describe what God has recorded there. That Messiah will literally rule and reign for 1,000 years. So that's still in the future. And so they would say, well, just as in 6 days God worked and man works, and he gave a seventh day for rest, and Moses in Exodus 20 goes back to the days of creation. By the way, these people who argue for an old earth or, large portions of time between the days of creation contradict directly Moses, because Moses didn't teach there were big gaps of time between the days of creation, or that the days of creation were long periods of time. Based on divine commentary that the Spirit wrote through him, there were 6 literal 24-hour days in which the world was created. And so the analogy, they would say, is God worked on 6 days. God is working for 6,000 years, and on the 7th day and the final 1,000 years, so to speak, because a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years is like a day, not contradicting the literal days of creation, they would reason that the Messiah will reign for 1,000 years. So I find that interesting because nowhere in the Old Testament is the length of the Messiah's reign given. But we know in the New Testament it is indeed 1,000 years. So there came a time in American history, it was called the Scopes Trial. Many of you are familiar with it. There's a hardcore pagan by the name of Clarence Darrow. We brought our children one time to that town in Tennessee and went into the courtroom and saw the logistics of it. And he debated a very famous politician by the name of William Jennings Bryan. He was a very, very intelligent man, but Darrow tried to confuse him on the stand. Unfortunately, he didn't have real clear answers, but he keyed off of a time of creation that a gentleman by the name of Bishop James Ussher wrote. Ussher was a converted Roman Catholic, and he started and helped lead the Anglo-Irish Church. In fact, he was the Archbishop. And so they did have an Episcopalian form of government. In either case, he was a real scholar. He attended Trinity College, got in like at the age of 13, and he was ordained by the age of 20. And of course, the primary opponents of biblical Christianity, so we're talking about the Protestant church in Ireland, and the primary opponents of biblical Christianity were a group known as the Jesuits. And the Jesuits were started by a pope in deference to the Protestant Reformation to try to defend Roman Catholic doctrine. I studied under the largest community of Jesuits in the world when I was at Boston College. They're an interesting group of guys. And so he wanted to, in a very scholarly way, because these guys were like super scholarly, they have a minimum of 12 years of formal education, quote unquote, after what we would call today high school, to be able to be considered to become a Jesuit priest. So they're highly educated men, and some have more than that. I remember I had a guy by the name of Father Flanagan. He was I took a course by him my freshman year, and his title was Dr. Flanagan. I said, well, what kind of doctorate do you have? Well, he said, well, how many? I said, how many? He said, I have a PhD in philosophy. I have a DDS, a dental surgery degree, so he's a medical doctor as well. And he had a third doctorate as a doctor of jurisprudence. So he had 3 doctoral degrees. So that kind of educational prowess was not uncommon there at Boston College. With that said, these guys are lost. These guys deny the authority of Scripture. And so Ussher, trying to take a scholarly approach, did incredible amount of details. he wrote a book called the Annals. And in the Annals, he said that the day of creation was 4004 BC. And so if you have an older edition of the King James Bible, in fact, all the King James Bibles that were issued by the Gideons until the early 70s had that footnote in it, the day of creation, 4004 BC. I was speaking at a Methodist church once in Virginia, and the man thought that was inspired. And I said, well, that note is not inspired as such. That was a date that Bishop Ussher came up with, but I don't think he was that far off. Now, Luther, he was also a scholar of sorts, and he liked round numbers, and he said, well, it's around 4000 BC, because maybe there's a few generations where we cannot pinpoint the exact year. Kepler, who was the great astronomer, he concluded that the day of creation was 3992. So if you use Ussher's dating, it would be 60. We'd be in the year 6027. So we don't have to wait another 217 years like they do in the Jewish calendar. In Martin Luther's calculation, we'd be at 6023. At Kepler's, we'd be at 6015. Look, we do not know the exact year of creation. It cannot precisely, but it's right around there. We can know that from what we do have in the biblical accounts. But there's nothing in Scripture that says that this world needs to go for some 6,000 years. And then we have to bring in the Messiah. There's many problems with that. And by the way, when Y2K came around the year 2000, people got real excited and said, well, not only is there going to be some disaster with the computers of the world, this is going to bring in, the rapture of the church and the Antichrist, and, 4,000 years before Christ, the world was created, and now we're going to hit the year 2000 and 6,000, and, there's real problems with that. One, you can't set dates. Number two, Christ taught that you can't set dates. And number two, it destroys the doctrine of imminency. In the truest sense. It maybe not destroys it, but it certainly rewrites it, because it appears after the rapture of the church, there's a short time, weeks, days, months, I doubt centuries, which you would need if you somehow ascribe to this way of thinking, at least if you followed the Jewish calendar. Because, again, they would say he could come, Messiah, before or at the 6,000 year mark. But still, if he came then you have 217 years to wait before the Messiah could return. And yet the Bible teaches the imminent return of Christ. And as you study the events that unfold after the rapture, which we just spent 31 weeks studying, and if you go to communitybiblechurch.us or search the scriptures, all of those messages are now available. It appears that the time frame is very short, that there's a short throw of time after the rapture. There is a space of time because the Antichrist then has to come on the scene and provide peace. And so I have suggested that probably that's when the great war of Gog and Magog, that's specifically mentioned in Ezekiel 38 and 39, right down to the nations involved, a war that has never taken place in either biblical or recorded human history. But it is going to take place, and I think that would be the impetus for what would follow after, for a man to come on the scene to present world peace. And with so many of these Muslim nations that are described, because we know the nations that are engaged, and they represent largely the Muslim populations of the world, and for God to put them down, it would be an easy plan to then build the next temple on the Temple Mount. Lay all that aside. The Bible teaches the imminent return of Christ. And so you don't want to get caught up in Jewish tradition in the Talmud that is filled with errors, that has made wrong conclusions even from their Old Testament of how God saves a person. Your authority is Scripture alone, and that's where you need to start.
Dr. Carl Broggi answers your questions about the Bible and living the Christian life Tuesday mornings at 11 on The Light, 88.7 FM, and online around the world at wagp.net.